My name is Justin Nobel. I'm 28. I'm a freelance magazine journalist, and I also write a blog about death for the funeral industry. The first time I wrote about death was Ricky Teague. I was working at a small newspaper in Northern California. Ricky was a 15-year-old kid killed by his best friend in a drunk driving accident. And it was my first day at the newspaper. It was my first newspaper article ever, and I was frightened. I realized that although Ricky was dead, I had his life in my hands. What I wrote would be how his mother remembered him, would be how the whole community remembered him, and I was really scared I was going to mess it up. But I didn't. I wrote a really good story, and it was at that time that I learned that through death you can tell the story of a life, and people remember that. People will really respect you for it. And when I left the newspaper a year later to go to the Arctic and live with the Inuit, Ricky's mother hugged me, she held me close, and she told me she would never forget me. I spent 3 months living with the Inuit in the Canadian Arctic. I wrote newspaper articles for a newspaper up there, and I came back to New York. I had no work, but I remember the power of telling stories about death, and I decided to start an obituary writing company. The idea didn't work out, but in researching it, I was connected with a group that was trying to revolutionize the funeral industry. They were going to bring it online. And one of the things they wanted was for someone to write a blog about death. I thought that was amazing. I'm on it. And Digital Dine was born, a way for me to explore death across history and around the world. And in the past 2 years, I've done that. I've covered Chinese stripper funerals, Ghanaian fantasy coffins, animal suicide, the disturbing Japanese custom of lonely death. And I've learned a lot about death. I see the world through death now, and it isn't frightening. It's fascinating. I realize that where there is death, there is a very creative human response to death, and death inspires culture, it inspires art, it inspires religion and story. When people find out I write about death, they often ask what the craziest death story I've ever reported on. And that would have to be the Japanese legend of Obosuteyama, or the legend of Granny Dump Mountain. Now, legend has it that in rural Japan, when elders reached 70, their sons would carry them on their backs up a holy mountain and leave them at the top to die of exposure and starvation. And this legend is discussed in books, in films, in poems, but yet no one in Japan really knows if this ever actually happened. So I went there to find out. And first I spoke with anthropologists at the National Museum in Tokyo, and they led me to a small town in the north called Tono. And there, a couple museum curators took me to a hill outside town. And on that hill, even as late as the 19th century, apparently old people were put there at the beginning of the winter to die. And by the end of the winter, they'd be dead. And it seemed like this was it. This was Obosuteyama. Old people really were taken to a spot to die. But this was just a story. I just had people in town telling me this story. There were no bones, there was no graveyard there was no cemetery. And I realized that often in stories about death, there are no bones, there will be no cemetery. You just have the story. And that brings us to the story I'd like to report for the second part of this interview. Here we have the Hudson River. The legendary explorer Henry Hudson came up this river 401 years ago looking for the Northwest Passage. He didn't find it, but in 1611 in James Bay in the wilds of northern Quebec, Henry Hudson was mutinied by his men. They put him on a small boat with his son and 7 other crew members and set him adrift amidst the icebergs to die. except no one knows where he actually died. So we are going to go to the wilds of northern Quebec and see if we can find out. We're on the James Bay Highway. It's a road that goes north from a small town in northern Quebec, Matagami, and it goes about 600 kilometers into the deep taiga of Quebec. We're headed towards the Cree Indian community of Waskaganish. Somewhere along the shores of James Bay, near here, Henry Hudson spent a horrible winter. I think about Henry Hudson on his journey searching for the Northwest Passage. There's a persistence and there's a perseverance, but in the end, it is him in his boat with his thoughts, facing the cold, facing the sea. There is a fear there. There is a fear of the unknown, but I think it's in that fear, it's in that unknown where death blossoms, where ideas come. We don't know what there is. So death is interesting because you have these different faces of humanity that have developed to explain it. There's few topics where you have such a diverse outpouring of human creativity that develops in response to it. Death has generated all sorts of odd phenomena around the world, and this is one of the things I've explored in Digital Dine, the Death blog.
Up until 35 years ago, we were relatively in isolation. The only way or the only means of getting to Waskaganish at that time was either through taking a train into Ontario to the northernmost area of Ontario called Moose Factory to get to the coast, and then you could take a float plane to get to Waskaganish.
We're in the cemetery in Waskaganish, and you can see tombstones, you can see crosses, simple wooden crosses. What we just learned though is that it's only recently that the Cree began burying people in this manner. It used to be that when someone died, they were buried on the land in the spot where they died, marked with maybe just a stone or a stick. And it's really interesting to hear this because this is quite similar to how Hudson disappeared from us. He is a man with markers all over the world. There's bridges, there's towns, there's rivers, there's bays, there's schools named after him. And yet, this man has nothing to mark his grave.
And if that was 300 years ago, then that area itself would have been just filled over. You know, grass would have grown, things would have moved around, trees might have grown on top of it. So, you know, I guess that adds to the mystique of the legend of Henry Hudson.
So there are 4 theories as to what happened to Hudson after the mutiny. The first is that he was murdered outright by his men. His body sunk to the bottom, destroyed the evidence. The second is that he made it to shore, but he was massacred by the Indians. The third, he made it to shore and the Indians helped them. He traveled south all the way to the Ottawa Valley, present-day Ottawa, the capital of Canada, and Hudson has descendants running around to this day. The fourth, and the theory most historians believe, is that Hudson perished at sea. He never made it to shore. And so Henry Hudson, this man with markers all over the world, schools, rivers, expressways, mountains, towns named after him, this man with so many markers has nothing to mark his grave except for the icy waters of James Bay. Henry! Henry!